April 12th, 1943. A cold wind swept across the edge of the Beaumont-le-Roger airfield in northern France, carrying with it the distant rumble of engines and the sharp scent of oil and burnt cordite. The Luftwaffe ground crews were still clearing debris from the morning's interception when the shape appeared on the horizon, dragged slowly by a German half-track. Even from a distance, the aircraft looked wrong, too big, too heavy, too intact for something that had crash-landed under fire. The German pilots, watching from the dispersal hut, stepped closer without meaning to, their boots crunching on the frost-coated gravel as the American giant came into full view. It was a bowing B-17F Flying Fortress, captured almost whole after its pilot attempted an emergency landing in a nearby field. The aircraft had taken dozens of cannon strikes and hundreds of machine gun rounds. Yet its wings were still solid, its tail still standing, and its engines, though battered, had not torn free. Oberleutnant Karl Fischer, a 24-year-old Luftwaffe pilot with 7 kills to his name, stopped midway across the tarmac and stared at IT with a silent disbelief he refused to show on his face. Only hours earlier, he had been among the Messerschmitts, diving through contrails, trying to tear one of these monsters down. Now IT sat in front of him, scarred but undeniably alive. Up close, the first thing Fischer noticed was the skin of the aircraft, thick, riveted aluminum plates that felt more like ship hull plating than an airframe. He dragged his gloved hand across one of the torn sections, feeling the edges of bent metal that had refused to shatter. Behind him, Feldwebel Otto Brandt muttered, "This thing should have fallen apart in the air. How did IT stay up?" No one answered. The truth was uncomfortable. They had all fired on B-17 formations, sometimes emptying their entire belts into a single bomber, only for IT to remain in formation like a wounded but unyielding beast. A German mechanic pointed to a jagged hole near the wing root, where fluid still leaked in sticky black beads. SEL-F sealing fuel tanks, he said quietly, like the British use, only thicker. Fischer leaned closer, pressing a fingertip against the rubbery inner lining of the tank's torn edge. It flexed under pressure, layered and dense, designed to swell when hit and choke off oxygen before fuel could ignite. He swallowed hard. If their own fighters had these, the casualty lists might look very different. Then came the guns, 13 of them, mounted in turrets, windows, hatches, and blisters, each one positioned with unnerving logic. Fischer climbed the crew ladder and stepped into the belly, ducking into the tight tunnel leading to the ball turret. He imagined what it must have been like inside during combat. Oxygen mask on, temperature dropping to 30 below zero, enemy fighters swarming like hornet sand. The realization hit him. Every angle was covered, every approach was watched, every pilot who had attacked a fortress had been staring down barrels they never saw. The Germans moved deeper inside. The cockpit still smelled faintly of hydraulic fluid and burnt wiring. Bullet holes peppered the armored seats where the American pilot and CO pilot had once sat, but the structure held strong. Fischer placed a hand on the throttle quadrant. It felt heavy, industrial, engineered with a brutality he had never seen in German aircraft. Here was an airplane built not to fly gracefully, but to survive the sky at its angriest. One of the intelligence officers spoke quietly as he inspected the damage. "They call it a flying fortress," he said. "Now I understand. WHY. Fisher didn't respond. His eyes were on the ceiling, where flak fragments had chewed through insulation but failed to reach the vital lines. Above, layer after layer of protection. Armor around the cockpit, reinforced spars, redundant systems. Everything about the machine screamed durability. He stepped back outside, into the cold afternoon light. The B-17's shadow stretched across the ground like the silhouette of some steel predator, its massive tail towering over the men gathering beneath it. Fisher took a slow breath. He remembered the countless times he dove on bomber formations, firing, climbing, turning back, wondering how these beasts stayed in the air when logic said they should fall. Now he knew, and for the first time, he felt something uncomfortable settle in the back of his mind. Respect. The Germans circled the captured B-17 like men approaching a wounded animal. Cautious but fascinated. Intelligence officers barked orders, photographers snapped pictures, and pilots still wearing flight jackets and residue of exhaust. Fumes from their morning sorties waited for permission to climb aboard. When the signal came, Oberleutnant Karl Fischer followed the group up the ladder again. This time stepping fully into the heart of the aircraft he had tried dozens of times to kill. From the sky, the interior was darker than he expected, lit only by the pale daylight pushing through shattered plexiglass panels. The metal catwalk, beneath his boots, flexed slightly as he moved, and the cramped walls amplified every sound around him: footsteps, murmurs, the low rumble of the wind sliding across the fuselage. It felt like stepping inside a steel cavern built for war. Lieutenant Weber, another pilot from Fischer's squadron, squeezed past him and pointed toward the waist gun positions. "Look at this," he muttered. 2 gunners on each side, covering the entire rear quadrant. Nitrogen monoxide wonder so many of us get hit on the approach. The waist guns were mounted on rotating pin, each manned by a gunner who could sweep the sky with streams of .50 caliber fire, the ammunition belts still scattered across. The floor in loose coils looked like steel snakes. Fisher picked one up. It was heavier than he imagined. Each round, thick and gleaming even under the soot, promised to tear apart anything unfortunate enough to fly into its path. He imagined what it must have been like approaching this machine from behind while its gunners fired thousands of rounds per minute. IT wasn't just defense. IT was a moving fortress with teeth. The group moved toward the radio room. The Luftwaffe's intelligence captain opened the door and immediately froze. Even the radio operator's station was armored. Sheets of metal lined the bulkhead, clearly engineered to keep the man alive long enough to send out coordinates if the bomber was doomed. "They protect every crewman," the captain whispered, "not just the pilots." Fisher stepped into the narrow walkway connecting the compartments. Bullet holes pierced the fuselage in dozens of places, yet most of them had been stopped by internal ribs or redundant layers of plating. "One plane takes all of this and still flies home," he said under his breath. Weber heard him and nodded slowly. "And we attacked them by the hundreds." He replied, "Imagine them with escorts." They pushed forward into the bomb bay. The doors hung crookedly, jammed during the emergency landing, but the mechanism inside told another story entirely. Even empty, the bay smelled faintly of explosive residue, the kind that clung to metal. Nitrogen monoxide, matter how long I'd been exposed to air. Fisher looked up at the catwalk running across the narrow space. American crewmen walked over that tiny strip, while the bomber dropped thousands of pounds of explosives over factories, rail yards, and airfields like this one. Hard to believe they walk through this in flight, Weber said. Fisher didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the structural beams surrounding him, thick, bolted, unapologetically functional. It reminded him of industrial machinery, not a plane, something meant to endure stress, damage, and catastrophe while continuing forward with its mission. When they reached the nose compartment, the air grew colder. The plexiglass nose cone had shattered, allowing the wind to howl through. Fisher crouched beside the Norden bomb site, covered hastily by a tarp the Germans had thrown over it. He knew this device was a guarded secret, something the Allies protected with almost religious severity, even under the canvas. Its presence felt like a warning. The Americans had brought science, precision, and industrial might to a scale Germany could not match. As the officers examined the bomb site, Fisher looked down at the scorched floor, where fragments of flak had burst through the hull. He imagined the bombardier crouched there during the attack. The plane shaking, engines screaming, aluminum rattling under the impact of enemy fire. And yet, the fortress still made it to the ground in one piece, for the first time since the war began. Fisher felt a subtle shift deep in his chest, not fear, but a kind of reluctant acknowledgement. This aircraft was more than a target. It was a symbol of a country capable of producing thousands of machines, built to absorb punishment no fighter pilot could truly comprehend. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the broken nose panels. The sound echoed through the aircraft like a distant drum. Fisher stepped back, resting his hand on an internal beam that felt cold as ice. He had fought many battles in the air. He had seen bombers fall burning from the sky, but standing inside this one, surrounded by damage that should have killed it but didn't, he understood something new. This war was not just about pilots or aircraft. It was about industry, engineering, and the terrifying power of a nation capable of replacing losses faster than they could be inflicted. And the B-17, massive and unyielding even in defeat, was proof. The officers finally ordered everyone out so the engineering teams could begin their inspection. But Fisher lingered near the exit, staring one last time into the gloom of the captured bomber. As he stepped back onto the ladder, a strange quiet hung over the group of Luftwaffe pilots beneath the wing. These were men who usually joked after missions, traded stories about chase angles and gun harmonization, bragged about the day's kills. Now they stood grouped in a tight semicircle, their faces set in grim contemplation as the American war machine loomed above them like a fallen giant refusing to die. Hauptmann Reinhard Vogt, a veteran with over 20 bomber kills, crossed his arms and tilted his head as he studied the B-17's massive vertical stabilizer. "Do you remember that formation in February?" he asked softly. "The one we hit over the channel?" Fisher nodded. They all remembered. Dozens of fighters had torn into a group of fortresses, hammering them with cannon fire until 3 of the bombers finally broke formation. 2 went down quickly, but the last one, they chased it for almost 20 minutes as it drifted alone toward the coast, engines flaming, stabilizers shredded, tailguns still firing defiantly until the plane vanished into the clouds. "It looked just like this," Vogt said. "Half destroyed, but still flying." No one disagreed. Everyone had a story like that. A bomber that refused to fall, a gunner who kept shooting after being mortally wounded, a formation that tightened instead of scattering in panic. Fisher suddenly understood why the American crews seemed fearless in the air. They trusted the machine beneath them. The intelligence captain approached with a clipboard, clearing his throat. "Gentlemen, we've confirmed most of the internal systems. The armor is thicker than expected. The wiring is redundantly routed. Even the oxygen lines are reinforced." He tapped his pencil against the paper. "This aircraft was hit more than 60 times. At least a dozen cannon strikes. And yet it landed. Not belly landed. Weber's eyes narrowed. "If this is standard for them, what does that mean for us?" The captain didn't answer. He didn't need to. The roar of approaching engines broke the silence. 3 Me-109s descended from the clouds and swept low over the field, their shadows flashing across the tarmac before they taxied toward the revetments. The sound should have been comforting, familiar, sharp, confident. Instead, it only highlighted the contrast between the lean, fast fighters and the hulking American fortress in the center of the field. A predatory bird versus a steel-clad beast. Fisher glanced from the Messerschmitts to the B-17. One was built to strike with precision and speed. The other was designed to endure hell itself and keep going. He realized suddenly that Germany's greatest weakness wasn't their pilots or their tactics, it was the cold math of industry. The Americans could lose a plane like this today and replace it tomorrow. Germany could not. He walked along the wing until he reached the massive No. 3 engine. It had taken a direct cannon hit. The casing was torn open like a ruptured ribcage, yet the engine mounts still held firm. The propeller blades were bent, but not shattered. "Even wounded, it keeps fighting," Fisher murmured. Vogt overheard him. "Exactly," he replied. "And we keep attacking from angles covered by their guns. They built this plane knowing how we fight." As the engineers began removing panels, the pilots stepped back to give them room. Inside the exposed engine compartment, Fisher saw layer after layer of metal and tubing arranged with ruthless practicality. Nothing delicate, nothing elegant. Everything built for combat longevity, not beauty. A junior mechanic crouched beside the wreckage and pointed with a grease-blackened finger. "See this? Triple-layered fire suppression. One layer would be enough for one of our bombers." He moved his hand lower. "Hydraulic backups. If one line fails, another takes over." He tapped the frame, reinforced with internal bracing. This monster could fly with an entire section shot away. Weber exhaled slowly. So this is how they crossed the continent. This is why they reached Berlin. Nobody argued. Watching the engineers dismantle the fortress was like watching someone open the armor of a medieval knight, revealing how he survived wounds that should have killed him outright. Beyond the open hangar doors, the sky had begun to darken with incoming clouds. The afternoon light dimmed, and the bomber's shadow grew long across the concrete. Fisher stared at the silhouette, imagining once again the terrifying sight of dozens of these machines marching across the sky in rigid formation, each one bristling with guns, each one capable of taking punishment no fighter pilot could truly comprehend until today. "This is the enemy," Vogt said quietly. "No," Fisher replied after a moment. "This is their message." And standing beneath the wing of the battered but unbroken fortress, he finally understood it. Fisher stepped back as the engineers signaled for more light, their lantern beams sliding across the torn fuselage like surgeons preparing to open a wounded giant. A cold wind swept through the hangar, carrying the faint smell of oil, cordite, and burned metal. The rest of the pilots drifted inside, drawn not by orders but by something heavier, something unspoken. What they had seen today was no longer just a captured enemy aircraft. It was a revelation, and revelations had a way of unsettling even the bravest men. Hauptmann Vogt ran his thumb along a chunk of armor plating that had been cut away from the belly. 2 centimeters thick. And that's only the outer skin, he muttered. A mechanic nodded. There is more behind it, sir. Internal panels. Secondary shields. Vogt let the plate drop with a hollow metallic clatter that echoed through the hangar. The sound made Fischer's stomach tighten. German bombers didn't sound like that. They were lighter, faster, fragile. A young pilot, barely 20, spoke up from the back. "How many of these do they send at once?" he asked. No one answered immediately. Finally, Weber replied, his voice low. "Hundreds. And every month, the formations grow larger." The pilots exchanged uneasy glances. They all knew the truth. The Americans were not fighting a war of equal exchange. They were fighting a war of replacement. Germany's factories strained under constant bombing just to keep up. America's factories produced bombers like these the way bakeries produced bread. As the engineers opened another panel, a dense cluster of wires was revealed, bundled and routed in meticulous grids. If a cannon shell destroys one line, power reroutes elsewhere, the chief inspector explained. It is designed to function even while dying. The way he said it made Fischer's skin crawl. The B-17 was not just a bomber. It was a philosophy made of aluminum and steel, a belief that no single hit should ever decide the fate of a mission. Outside, the sky crackled with distant thunder. The first drops of rain pattered against the hangar roof, steady and cold. A mechanic pulled down the ladder and climbed into the radio compartment. Minutes later he leaned out, expression stunned. "The radio set alone weighs more than some of our entire cockpit assemblies," he said. "Long range, encrypted, shielded from interference. They can call help from anywhere." Vogt let out a slow exhale, "So they can fight their way in and coordinate their escape." He glanced around the circle of pilots. How do you defeat an enemy who can take this much damage and still talk to the rest of the sky? The question hung there, heavy and paralyzing. Fischer rubbed a hand over his jaw. "We trained to strike fast and disappear." "We were never meant to fight a wall of steel," Weber added, "and next year their escort fighters will have even longer range. We will not catch the fortresses alone for much longer." That realization struck the group harder than any cannon shell. Without isolated formations, there would be no easy kills. If the bombers were this tough already, what would happen when long-range escorts shadowed them all the way to Berlin? An uneasy silence settled in. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the metal roof like distant machine gun fire. It sounded unsettlingly similar to the thunder of American .50 caliber guns, the sound that haunted every Luftwaffe pilot who dared approach a bomber head-on. The intelligence. Captain cleared his throat again, softer this time. "Gentlemen, Command wanted to know whether the Americans have any weaknesses." He gestured toward the battered fortress, its metal hide gleaming under the lamps like the armor of a mythic beast. "We have found none that matter." The remark broke something in the room. The younger pilots exchanged fearful glances. The veterans stared at the floor. Fischer felt a knot form in his chest, not from fear of the bombers, but from the realization of what this meant for Germany, for the war, for the skies they had once ruled with confidence. Vogt finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "If this is what a damaged one looks like, imagine the ones that never get hit." Fischer said nothing. He didn't need to. The truth stood towering in front of them, riveted and unbreakable. And for the first time since the war began, the Luftwaffe pilots understood they might be facing not just an enemy, but inevitability itself. The engineers now moved into the tail section, carefully removing panels to inspect the defensive turrets. Fischer followed cautiously, his boots echoing on the narrow catwalk. Each step revealed more evidence of the aircraft's resilience. The tail gunner's station had taken multiple hits. Glass was shattered, metal bent, yet the turret was intact. Fischer could almost imagine the young American behind the twin .50 caliber guns, strapped in ice-cold conditions, firing at me 1/9 that screamed, toward him at hundreds of miles per hour. Lieutenant Weber's voice broke the silence. Imagine being inside this at 27,000 feet. The temperature must have been unbearable, the oxygen barely sufficient. And yet they flew into the jaws of our fighters day after day. Fischer nodded slowly, his eyes tracing the reinforced beams above the turret. He could see where fragments had pinged and glanced off the metal like bullets bouncing off stone. The Germans had trained to exploit weak spots, but here, it seemed the Americans had anticipated every tactic. Every angle of attack, Fischer stepped into the narrow passage leading to the radio compartment. Wires hung like thick vines, routed redundantly through armored conduits. The young mechanic pointed to a junction box. Even if a shell severs this, signals reroute instantly. The bomber can still call for help, even if it is on fire. Fischer ran a gloved hand over the junction. He felt the craftsmanship, the sheer precision, and the deadly intent embedded in every inch. The B-17 was not merely a plane. It was a weaponized fortress designed to endure, adapt, and strike back even when mortally wounded. Outside, rain splattered against the torn fuselage. Fischer leaned his head out of the bomb bay doors and felt the cold droplets against his face. He imagined the American bombardier staring through the Norden bomb sight, calculating trajectories while the plane shuddered under flak. He could hear the imaginary roar of the engines, the clatter of bullets, the orders shouted in tense coordination. The reality of the sky battles, the sheer chaos. The resilience of the fortresses pressed down on him like lead. The intelligence captain motioned toward the wing, where several structural panels had been removed. The spars, the ribs, the redundancy in load-bearing sections, they allow the plane to survive structural hits that would down any of our own aircraft. Fischer crouched and traced the ribs with his fingertips, imagining them flexing under fire, keeping the wings aloft while his own fighters had struggled to bring down just one section. He shivered. It wasn't fear. It was comprehension and respect mixed with a gnawing unease. Vogt finally broke the silence, his voice low but clear. This is why we've lost so many men attacking them. And yet, every day, more arrive. He gestured toward the nose of the plane, where the glass cockpit still bore scars from cannon fire. Fischer stared into the empty pilot's seat. He could almost see the young American, determined and grim, trusting the fortress beneath him more than his own instincts. The thought sank deep. The pilots weren't fearless because they were brave. They were fearless because their machine gave them no choice but to survive. The rain eased slightly, leaving the fuselage slick and gleaming. Fischer took a deep breath, trying to shake off the weight pressing on him. He climbed down the ladder slowly, giving one last look at the B-17's massive, battle-scarred form. It seemed alive, resilient, almost defiant, and in that moment, he understood a truth he could never unlearn. This was not just an enemy plane. It was a statement of industrial might, tactical foresight, and the relentless power of a nation prepared for total war. He stepped onto the tarmac, boots splashing in puddles, and felt the shadow of the fortress stretch over him like a silent warning. Around him, the other Luftwaffe pilots exchanged glances, some with awe, others with a new wariness. The engineers continued their meticulous work, peeling back the layers of armor, systems, and wiring, revealing more of the secrets that made the B-17 such a terror in the sky. And Fisher knew, deep down, that the war had just become infinitely harder. For every pilot who had once thought the flying fortress could be conquered, Fisher and the other pilots gathered near the nose, watching as the engineers carefully removed the bomb bay doors. The sight of the empty compartments, designed to carry thousands of pounds of explosives across enemy territory, struck a deep chord. Here was precision and power fused with armor and redundancy, a combination no Luftwaffe pilot had expected in such magnitude. Every detail, every bolt, every wire, every gun mount spoke of a machine that could endure hell and still complete its mission. Lieutenant Weber, usually full of bravado, leaned against the fuselage, silent. Every sortie we flew against them. Maybe we were just scratching the surface, he murmured. Fisher glanced at him, recognizing the grim realization in his eyes. The flying fortress was more than steel. It was strategy incarnate, a fortress in the air that demanded not just courage but ingenuity to challenge. And even then, luck often dictated survival. The intelligence captain approached, pointing at the ball turret still wedged beneath the fuselage. Imagine this, a single gunner, cramped in here, facing fighters coming from any angle. Yet, it works. They fight as a team, each covering the other. Redundancy everywhere. Fisher squatted beside the turret, peering inside. It was almost grotesque in its efficiency, yet elegant in function. The cramped metal sphere had taken hits before, yet its mountings remained firm. The Americans had turned vulnerability into a weapon. Outside, the clouds thickened, blotting out the late afternoon sun. The wind rattled the hangar's edges, carrying with it the distant roar of German fighters taking off for their evening patrols. Fisher imagined those same fortresses rising into the sky, formation after formation, escorted by P-51s or P-38s, all coordinated, all bristling with defensive fire. The thought made his stomach tighten not with fear, but with an acute awareness of the immense challenge they faced. The younger pilots shuffled nervously, breaking the long silence. "How can we possibly shoot one down?" one whispered, almost to himself. Fisher didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked along the side of the fuselage, tracing the bullet scars and gaping panels. Each hole told a story of attacks that had failed. Every dent, every tear, was proof that these bombers were living history, surviving assaults that would have destroyed lesser aircraft. Vogt finally broke the tension, his voice steady but grim. "We need to learn from this. Not just fear it." He gestured toward the engineers continuing their work. "Understand how it works. Find the vulnerabilities, but remember this. One B-17 is a lesson in industrial and tactical supremacy." Fisher nodded slowly. It wasn't just about the plane itself. It was about what the plane represented, the unrelenting capacity of the enemy to replace, rebuild, and endure. As the light faded outside, Fisher took one last survey of the bomber. The massive wings, the bristling gun positions, the reinforced cockpit, all of it formed an almost invincible silhouette. Standing beneath it, He felt the weight of the war shift slightly in his mind. The sky he had once dominated felt different now, heavier, more threatening, and the flying fortress had taught him a lesson no combat sortie ever could, that sometimes the greatest weapon was not the pilot's skill, but the machine itself, engineered to survive, endure, and strike back, no matter what. Fisher stepped down to the tarmac once more, boots splashing in the puddles from earlier rain. Around him, the Luftwaffe pilots dispersed, some murmuring to each other, others staring silently at the massive bomber. The engineers' lights reflected off the riveted metal, casting long, ominous shadows. In that quiet, Fisher understood this was a turning point. The war in the skies had changed, and the flying fortress was its herald. Night began to settle over Beaumont-Larger, the sky darkening to a deep slate grey. The captured B-17 sat silently under the dim floodlights, its enormous frame casting a shadow that stretched across the rain-slicked tarmac like a looming predator. Fisher stood apart from the group, hands tucked into his flight jacket, watching the engineers move inside the fuselage. Every panel they removed, every wire they traced, reinforced the same lesson. This was no ordinary bomber. This was a machine built to defy destruction. And the realization gnawed at the Luftwaffe pilots more with each passing moment. Vogt walked slowly alongside Fisher, voice low and heavy. "I've flown against many bombers, many formations, but nothing prepared me for this," he said. Fisher nodded, the knot in his chest tightening. He could picture the formation flights over Europe, the relentless push toward Germany, the dogged resolve of crews who trusted their machine over the sky itself. Every story he'd heard of fortresses refusing to fall now had a tangible proof before him. In metal and rivets and scorched aluminum, the younger pilots shifted nervously nearby. They had trained for months on theoretical weaknesses, firing at studying diagrams but standing next to the actual B-17. With every cannon scar visible, every reinforced panel exposed, they felt the enormity of the challenge. The flying fortress was more than the sum of its parts. It was an ideology, an ironclad message that industrial might could overcome even the deadliest fighter tactics. Fisher turned his gaze toward the bomb bay, imagining the weight of thousands of pounds of explosives, the precise calculations of the bombardier, the synchronized coordination of the gunners. He realized the Americans had not just engineered a plane, they had engineered resilience, teamwork, and an almost relentless faith in their creation. A single bomber was a fortress. A formation was an unstoppable army in the sky. Weber finally broke the silence. "We always thought we were the hunters," he said softly. "But with these, it feels like we've been running into a trap we can't see until it's too late." Fisher's eyes followed the silhouette of the tail, scarred but upright, the ball turret still intact. He felt the weight of inevitability pressing down. The Americans could absorb what Germany could never replace. They could keep flying, keep striking, keep surviving, and every failed interception was a lesson paid for in blood. The intelligence captain approached once more, clipboard in hand, a quiet finality in his posture. "Document everything," he instructed the pilots. "This is the future of American bombing. Note the armor, the guns, the redundancies. Learn it. There is no exaggeration here. This is what you face in the coming months." Fisher nodded, feeling a chill run down his spine. They had fought bravery and skill before. Now they faced engineering and endurance on a scale they hadn't imagined possible. As the night deepened, the hangar emptied slowly, leaving the B-17 standing alone under the floodlights. Fisher lingered, tracing the edge of the wing with his gloved hand. The scars of battle told their story. Cannon hits, flak punctures, torn metal, yet intact, upright, defiant. Every pilot knew that tomorrow they would return to the skies and face formations like this, armed not only with their own skill, but with the bitter knowledge of what they were truly up against. Finally, Fischer stepped back, boots crunching against the wet gravel. He cast one last glance at the massive machine. It was more than an aircraft. It was a statement, a warning, a shadow that stretched far beyond the airfield, reaching into the heart of every German pilot who dared to challenge it. And in that shadow, Fischer understood a truth that would never leave him in the skies above Europe. The flying fortress was not just a plane, it was an inevitability. Dawn crept slowly over the horizon, pale light cutting through the morning mist. Fischer stood at the edge of the tarmac, boots soaked from overnight rain, staring up at the massive silhouette of the B-17 one last time. The hangar doors had been secured, and the engineers had packed away their tools, leaving the fortress alone, almost reverent in its quiet strength. Fischer felt the weight of the previous day pressing on him, a lesson not taught in flight school, not learned in dogfights, but carved into metal and steel. He remembered every detail: the reinforced cockpit, the labyrinth of redundant wiring, the bristling gun positions, the scarring of countless cannon shells that hadn't managed to bring it down. Every compartment he had entered had revealed a new layer of resilience, a new testament to the industrial might backing each crew. The flying fortress had survived things no other bomber could, and it had done so with crews relying on it as much as it relied on them. Vogt approached silently, standing beside Fischer without a word. Together, they watched the sun strike the aluminum skin, making it glint like molten silver. The realization settled in like frost. Germany's fighters could attack, evade, and kill, but each B-17 was built to endure, to persist, and to continue the mission against overwhelming odds. The war in the skies had shifted. Tactics alone were no longer enough. The flying fortress was a challenge not just to skill, but to endurance, strategy, and the very capacity to wage total war. The younger pilots, still lingering at the edges of the airfield, exchanged uneasy glances. Fear, respect, and awe mingled in their expressions. They had imagined a day when the Luftwaffe dominated the skies. And yet here, under the weight of industrial precision and engineering mastery, they understood that dominance was fragile. The Americans' edge was not just technology, it was the relentless power to replace, rebuild, and endure, plane after plane, sortie after sortie. Fischer took a deep breath and stepped closer to the wing. He ran a gloved hand along the riveted edge, feeling the cold steel. "It's not just a plane," he murmured. "It's a statement. And we've just read the message." Vogt nodded silently. No one spoke. No words could fully encompass what they had witnessed. The flying fortress had delivered a lesson far more potent than any airstrike: resilience, coordination, and the unstoppable force of a nation's industrial will. As the wind picked up, carrying the distant hum of German fighters preparing for another mission, Fischer allowed himself a final, measured thought. The skies above Europe would never be the same. Every sortie would carry the shadow of the fortress. Every engagement would echo the realization they had all felt inside the hangar. It was a lesson written not in theory, but in metal and rivets and the enduring spirit of men who refused to let a machine be broken. The B-17 stood silent, battered but unbowed, a colossus of war and symbol of relentless endurance. And Fischer knew as he finally turned to leave, that in the coming battles, every pilot who faced these bombers would carry a single truth: the flying fortress was more than a target. It was an inevitability,